Hello and welcome to Commendable Commotion. I'm Matthew Tannum LG and I'll be talking to some fascinating people about some equally fascinating topics that need more commotion. Today we continue our look at the subtle intricacies of filmmaking, and I'll be talking to one filmmaker whose insights have made a particularly remarkable impression on me. His name is Wing Flanagan, and you'll hear all about a very interesting short film he made a few years ago titled Kanashimi, and he'll also give some incredible advice about submitting a film to the festival circuit. It's not often that you meet such a deep thinking individual like Wing Flanagan, and I really felt compelled to include his thoughts on this podcast as it highlights so many important aspects of the creative process, not only for aspiring professionals, but also for casual listeners. So, without further ado, please enjoy our chat. Now, the first thing I'd like to ask you, I suppose, is let's see. I mean, first of all, just for people who may be unfamiliar, who are you and what do you do? Who is Wing Flanagan? And please, if you would.
Well, I started wanting to be in the film business a long time ago. I was literally about 3 or 4 years old, and my parents couldn't find a babysitter, so they took me to see a movie. And that movie was 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it was in 70 millimeters at the Cinerama Theater in Hollywood, California. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. And my mother told me that she thought I had fallen asleep. But when she looked down at me, my eyes were like wide as saucers and fixated on the screen. And I don't remember a lot about it, but I remember feeling as though the entire theater had been transported into space. And I was looking through a window at the solar system. And it was the first film I had ever seen that I can remember, and it became a benchmark. It was very difficult for me to watch science fiction films after that because most of them were so terrible, especially the ones on the afternoon movie in Los Angeles, and they were, just really bad. And I thought, gee, why can't all films be like this? And I thought, well, I should make movies. That should be what I do. And so it's been a sort of a dream of mine for literally my entire life. And Stanley Kubrick became and remains my very favorite film director of all time. And I think he's the benchmark, certainly, of American cinema, or American film directors, I should say. And of course, I've discovered other directors since then, especially Kurosawa, Michael Haneke, of all people, folks like that, Ozu. Yeah, even to a lesser extent, folks like Wolfgang Peterson, at least early in his career. And oh yes, we can't leave out Tarkovsky. So, I sort of became a film freak and started taking in all of this cinema. And living in Los Angeles at the time, of course, there's repertory theaters everywhere. That at least at the time, this has been, God, 40, 50 years ago at least, were able to show these films in a theatrical setting. I saw Small Change by Francois Truffaut on the big screen, and this is something that is kind of a rare pleasure these days. I got to see Lawrence of Arabia in 70 millimeters, which is just, oh, there's another great name, David Lean, which of course left me gobsmacked because I couldn't imagine that a historical drama, much less one so full of action, could be so acute a character study as this film was. And I've never seen anything like it since. A film that managed to combine spectacle with psychological insight and a kind of an intimate character study all in one. Extraordinary. Um, so anyway, yeah, the problems began when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and my parents divorced, and my mother kind of went to ground, and she moved the family across the United States to Florida. And one of the problems that I had was that people regarded me as being super intelligent, as being some kind of genius. And this is actually something that worked against me because I believed it. Because when you're a kid, you believe what you're told, basically. So I thought, oh, I'm a genius. I'm, pretty good. And I got hooked in with some people who, frankly, kind of exploited that. And yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail, but people who also were kind of wanting to get into show business and didn't know anything about it really, and thought that, having this genius, uh, in quotes, genius filmmaker wannabe on board would help all the way around. And the problem is that delayed my realization that there really is a path that you have to take to become a filmmaker professionally. And by the time I had sorted all that out and realized that I wasn't such a genius and that it required actual work, it was kind of too late. And I had to think about what I immediately needed, which was to make a living. And fortunately, I was a hobbyist computer programmer. And I discovered people would pay me for doing that. So this was at the end of the 90s when the internet was first becoming a big thing. So I got pulled into that business. Then I got married and had a family, and the dream kind of slipped further and further away. I had made as a kid a lot of short films, and done a lot of work, oddly enough, for talent agencies who wanted to have screen tests created for their clients so that they could send them off to casting directors and what have you. And I always wrote and directed a little piece that would showcase them rather than just sitting them down in front of a screen and feeding them lines. So that was kind of cool, and it was something of a creative outlet. There were talent agencies in Miami and in the Orlando area that were doing a pretty good business at the time. Films like Scarface that were shot in South Florida, and also Cape Fear. Scorsese shot the remake with Robert De Niro. So I had some exposure to the film industry, and I got to work on some movie sets occasionally, usually as something like an extra. But I always got as close to the crew as I possibly could and really scrutinized what they were doing and how they were doing it. And the great thing about Scarface in particular was that John Alonzo was the DP. We say DP in the US instead of DOP, but John Alonzo was the DP. And of course, he photographed Chinatown. So watching him work was just amazing. He approached every setup with such simplicity. The lighting was very simple. The lens choice was very simple. It's where I learned how they did car rigs, at least how he did car rigs. He actually took post office fiber tape, and it looked like a giant spider had descended on the cameras. They shot. There was a car rig where Tony Montana and his buddies were driving around, and it's just before the first drug deal that goes terribly wrong with the chainsaw. And I was there when they shot it, and I was as close as I could possibly get watching the way these two Panaflex Golds, they shot with Panaflex Golds and Panaflex Primes, the way they mounted them to the car and used this fiber tape just over and over and over again. And it was so, unprofessional looking on the one hand, but on the other, so practical, you know and
Yeah.
I did talk with one of the operators, and I forget his name now, but I was talking with him about this, and he said, yeah, we used this on Blue Thunder because he also shot Blue Thunder, and they
Right.
used this packing tape to mount Panaflex cameras to helicopters, which is just amazing to me, and if
It's such
anybody's
an
had to unwrap
amazing
a
scene.
package, yeah.
That
Anyway.
scene, no, I mean it's incredibly fascinating hearing about that. I mean it's amazing you got to witness that scene because that scene is just so in Scarface, like it just really sticks in the
Oh
memory
yeah.
afterwards. It's like the tension and that silence as they're
Yep.
driving up to the hotel. Well, I think now it's a hotel. I don't know what it was back then, but
Yeah, it was an apartment building back then at the time, and it was right on the strip off of Collins Avenue in Miami, which is, if you've ever been to Miami, that's the well-known strip where all the hotels and things are.
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so, on that note, now you mentioned Stanley Kubrick was your
Oh, yes.
favorite film director. So, I mean, given your experience with 2001, your formative experience with it, is it fair to say 2001 is your favorite film by him, or any others you may equally like? Or
That is actually hard to say because I have several favorites, and they're favorites in different categories. But for a long time, I would have said that 2001: A Space Odyssey was my favorite film of all time, and it may still be. But it's kind of narrowing to try and pick a single favorite because there are so many films that are excellent in so many ways. I will say this, as a total package, 2001 may be one of the greatest films ever made, simply because it hits so many notes, if you will. On the one hand, it is a sort of psychedelic mind expanding film, very much of its time. But on the other hand, it's also a fable, very much in the tradition of Homeric fables, obviously Odyssey. Um, and it's also a pretty good suspense film once you get on the Discovery spaceship. It's also a very poetic experience. It hits a lot of beats, and it's awesome. I mean, I know a lot of people say that, and it sounds like a weak word, but it truly is. It's an awesome cinematic experience. And if nobody out there has seen this in 70 millimeters, get thee to a theater and see if it's playing someplace. It's one of those rare films that does come back periodically, and it's just it's a mind expanding experience. No drugs required. Another one of my favorite films, oddly enough, is, well, a lot of people, it's their favorite film. It's The Shining, which is a
yeah,
film that I oddly enough did not appreciate very much when it first came out. I was a
huh,
bit disappointed in it because I had read the book multiple times. And you have to bear in mind, I was about 13 years old and I had expectations. It's before I really understood how. I mean, I loved his films before that, but I hadn't really understood what an iconic filmmaker he was. I don't want to say I didn't understand he was an icon. I didn't understand his methodology really. So when I saw it, I was a little disappointed because I thought, well, I didn't think it was particularly scary until I started having nightmares about it. And then I realized that this film had sneaked up under my skin in a way that no horror film before or since has. And that these nightmares about being chased through the hallways, there was something about the movie that taps into the subconscious. It kind of bypasses the frontal lobe and goes straight to the hindbrain. And that is its insidious power. And I can fully understand now how it is that it has become the film that it has. And I also understand how and why people, especially mainstream critics of the time, kind of missed it. Because now it's unimaginable that you could see it and not be affected by it. Um, there's there's something that's just insidiously um, psychological. I'm using these weak terms, but there's something that's just insidious about the way it creeps into the subconscious and nestles there and sticks around. And
yeah.
you've seen the American version, right? The one
Um,
that's about 20
a
minutes longer.
long time ago, a long time
Yeah.
ago. Most of the other times I watched it was the UK version. I know there was an extra
Right.
scene or two in the US version. You were the lucky ones, clearly, because you got the scene
Yes.
where there's a psychiatrist or something talking to the
Yes.
little boy, and yeah, because that was a scene that I was impressed by, for instance. And then I kind of was like, why did they take it out of the UK one? So yeah, I know what you mean. Are you familiar with the upcoming documentary that's being made about the making of Eyes Wide Shut?
I am not familiar with that.
It's a real it's I'm very excited for it. It's sort of about various things to do with the film. Tony Zierra is making it, and he did a film called
Okay.
Film Worker,
Yes,
which
I'm
was
familiar
yeah,
with Film Worker.
yeah,
I
yeah.
felt, I always felt bad for Leon Vitali
Yeah.
because his life was so consumed. On the one hand, I think of a moth to a flame, and Kubrick was the flame and he was the moth. And on the one hand, I completely get how he could sort of allow his life to be taken over by service to a genius, which Kubrick clearly was. On the other hand, I feel so terrible for him because his life was sort of eaten by
Yeah.
this guy. I'm so sad that he's passed away recently, because he's a person I would really love to have met and had a good conversation with.
Yeah, that was very sad. And that was very recent. I was, very taken aback by it. It was very sad indeed. Now, on a sort of lighter note, I suppose the your short film, Kanashimi, how
Yes.
did maybe all those inspirations that you grew up with, in these films you were seeing, how did they sort of influence, or to what extent did they influence maybe when you kind of decided, okay, I'm going to make the short film,
Hmm.
Kanashimi, which is a Japanese word, I believe. What is
Means
Kanashimi?
grief,
Grief, grief, grief, grief.
grief. Yeah.
And so how did that kind of how did your film going experience, as it were, and viewing experience, how did that sort of influence when you made your film?
Well, it's hard to explain. I've been a writer my entire life, and I've written stories and screenplays, most of which, of course, aren't very good. But one of the things, and Stephen King described this process too, you get these ideas, and they're not big enough. They're not well developed enough to form into a story immediately, but they hang out in the back of your mind. They kind of stay there on simmer. And then at some point, another idea that looks like it might belong will go and attach itself to it. And then another one and another one. And at some point, at least this is true of me, your subconscious will suddenly present this to you and say, hey, this is cool. What about this? And that was kind of the how, I guess, of the way Kanashimi developed. But the why goes into, and I remember the first idea that I got, Taxi Driver,
Yeah,
where De Niro's character Travis Bickle, there's a movie because who remembers main characters' names after 20 years? Yeah, if it's Travis Bickle, Rupert Pupkin from King of Comedy, and so on. Anyway, I thought, well, what if somebody intended to do a bad thing like this character and became a hero because by happenstance someone else was getting ready to do a worse thing, and just reflexively he ends up saving the day. And this, unlike Bickle, the man isn't crazy, but it gives him a second chance in a completely unexpected way. It gives him a chance to start his life again away from this desperate condition he was in. And I was fascinated by that notion. And the idea was, how do you frame this as a story? How do you make this happen? And then other ideas came in there, like for example, the mask,
yeah,
the no mask. And I thought, well, how do I visualize his change in personality or his change in perception? How do we know? How can the audience know that he's looking at his future self? This is the desperate person he's going to become. He's on his way to becoming a junkie. And how do we know that this is? I don't know if you noticed, but they're dressed the same way. They both
right.
have on jeans and black hoodies.
Yeah,
And how do we know? I mean, what is this desperate identity that he needs to shed? The mask. The mask sort of provided this opportunity. And I'm probably explaining more than I should. Kubrick hated explaining movies, and I don't mind because uh, I'm not him. But yeah, the mask sort of became important to the story because it's an indication. He owned it first. He gave it up, trying to get rid of his terrible memories. And then the junkie picked it up and thought, hey, a disguise. And when he has to confront it, he's really confronting his future self. He's seeing himself essentially 30 seconds into the future. This is what he was getting ready to do. This guy's doing it ahead of him. And that's what makes him snap back to reality and realize, as he says at the end, he needs help. This is the catalyst. Um, so yeah, eventually that all came together. Eventually it all, I'd been fascinated by no theater anyway, and the symbolism of the masks and the kind of formal quality that no theater has. So that sort of became, I started thinking, well, how can I introduce the masks? Okay, maybe he lived in Japan with his wife for some reason. Maybe he worked there. And maybe it's Halloween and they have a son, and the son dresses and puts on that very mask. And so it also becomes a symbol of his grief, that he can't let go of the grief that he has from losing his son. So all that sort of came together and crystallized at some point. And I was very fortunate because my wife, who is also my financial manager, knew that I wanted to make a movie. And she says, well, I think we have enough for you to make a movie now. And I had the idea for the script, and it all just kind of gelled, and off I went.
What was, if any, what was like, say, the most difficult part, like logistically or emotionally or in any way, practically anything of making that film? Was there any part particularly that was like difficult that really kind of you had to trudge through in a sort of, that kind of thing?
All of it was difficult, really.
Right. Yeah.
It's just a difficult process. It's not easy. And being a director is one of the toughest jobs in the world because, excuse me, you get to the set in the morning and you have all these faces turned to you. What do we do now? You have to answer all the questions. You have to tell them, okay, this is what we're doing. This is how we're doing it. Fortunately, having worked in the corporate world for many years, I have some skills that maybe a lot of artistic, boy, this is going to sound condescending, and I don't mean it to, but when you're an artist, quote unquote, you don't usually have the opportunity to develop the same kinds of skills that someone who works in a more corporate environment would. So there are lots of stories of filmmakers who are sort of undomesticated and who aren't as good at organizing things just from a logistical point of view. Kubrick was an exception to this. Usually you have producers and PAs that are able to keep you on track, and they're the ones who are more experienced with that. But I figured out very quickly that one of the things I had to do was to make sure that I oriented everyone in the morning. So we had a 15-minute morning before we started, a 15-minute meeting in the morning. And basically, I had a plan and I had a spreadsheet, and I would say, okay, so this is what we're going to try to shoot today, and this is how we're going to shoot it. We're going to start shooting from this side of the set and get all the coverage from here. Then we're going to go in for some close-ups. We're going to break for lunch because that should take us to about noon. And after we come back, after 45 minutes, we're going to do the setups from the other side of the room. So what we'll do is we'll get the lights turned around and we'll get the camera on the other side. And then it'll be ready and we can all come back in and we can do the other stuff. Any questions? And that's kind of how it went. And that was a great hedge against being disorganized. The funny thing is, and you've probably had other filmmakers tell you this because I suspect it's pretty common. It's good to have a plan because you have something to depart from. If you don't have a plan, you're going to waste a lot of time sitting there going, where should this be? Where should the camera be? What about the blocking? Where should these guys be standing? And having a plan, even a bad plan, at least gives you a starting point. At least you can say, all right, you can look at the paper and say, well, we'll put the camera there, aim it this way. Here's the storyboard, which I believe in storyboarding. And then after it's set up, you can look at it and say, okay, that was a crap idea, but at least you've started. And at
Yeah.
least you've got something that you can adjust. So if free advice to anyone, at least it worked for me, have a plan, but be ready to abandon it at the last minute because stuff happens. So it was all hard. The hardest part for me was the time constraint
Yeah.
because we had 10 days to shoot it, and that was it. That's all we had for principal photography. And when you're working with people that you're either paying very little or not paying because you don't have much money, you really have to, accommodate their schedules too. And carving out that 10 days, vacation time for me, vacation time for them, and so on, because most of them had day jobs, was really tough. And that constraint, it it kept us from getting a lot of the shots that I wanted to and a lot of the coverage, which in the editing room, coverage is what can save your bacon if things don't go exactly according to plan. It is said that John Huston never shot coverage, that he shot exactly what he wanted, and he would actually stop shooting when he knew there would be a cut. Instead of filming the entire scene in a wide master, he would take it only up to the point where he knew he was going to start doing close-ups, and then he would change the setup. A lot of actors said, well, he used to cut in camera. He wasn't really cutting in camera, but it must have seemed like that to them because of the way he shot. I would love to be able to go into a situation where I'm that confident, where I don't have to shoot coverage. But you know what? You better do it. You better do it if you can, because invariably when you get in the editing room, you're going to find that something doesn't work the way you thought it was, and you need a cutaway. You need an alternate take. You need a different angle to cover a potential continuity error. Something. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm sort of you asked me, or I asked you before this how long, and I told you I could talk forever, and you said go ahead and talk forever. So now you know why I cautioned you.
It's incredibly interesting advice. It's incredibly interesting advice. And I do like that about the whole coverage thing. I just do think it's important. I mean, things like that are, just so important for filmmakers to know. And I mean, I didn't actually know about that potential anecdote about John Huston. That's
Yeah,
that's amazing. I mean, did he do that when he was shooting The Dead? I wonder. Did you see The Dead? You ever see
I
that?
don't know.
It
I
was
don't know.
the one when he was very ill when he made it. It was James Joyce it was based on,
Okay,
but
yeah.
it was Angelica Houston was in it, and
I
but
didn't
yeah,
see The Dead. The last film of his that I saw was Under the Volcano.
yeah, I think that may have been the one before.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd never seen Under the Volcano. Is it an action film? Is it?
No, no, it's based on a Malcolm Lowry's novel
Oh,
about a British consul in Mexico around time I think that the Second World War was beginning, and he's an alcoholic, and his wife had cheated on him with his best friend, and he that's kind of what drove him to drink. And in the story, he goes into a church, and his Mexican friend says, pray to the Virgin for your wife to return. That's what you need. And his friend is very concerned about his mental health, and miraculously, she shows up with his best friend, with whom she cheated. So this sets up this story that's just it's full of tension because on the one hand, he loves his wife still and he wants her dead. On the other hand, he can't forgive her, and then he can't forgive himself for being inadequate. And it's an amazing performance by oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Irish actor or Irish name, Tom Jones. He was in Tom Jones.
right.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, you know who I'm talking about, I think.
Yeah. No, I'm
I'm so
familiar with.
sorry. I'm not remembering his name, but it'll come to me later, and I'll spit it out when we least expect it. But
I'm terrible at remembering actors' names and that kind of
yeah,
thing. So it's don't worry. I mean,
yeah,
don't worry. I'm used to it. It's just hard to remember all these different people. But
yes.
that is
Great British
interesting.
thespian, though.
Yeah, yeah.
Tremendous actor.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, I mean, I'll check that one out for sure. But anyway, I'm just wondering now, before we talk a little bit about how you felt when you saw your film on the big screen in Seattle, I believe it was,
Yeah,
when you
it was
had it at the
Seattle.
film festival. Yeah, that'll be very interesting to hear about. But one thing I suppose would be interesting to ask before that, completely unrelated to film, at surface level anyway.
Hmm?
But it was interesting, where I heard this, and it'd be interesting for you to talk about how you got into this if you can. Did you do any work for the CIA?
As far as I know, I've never done any work for the CIA. But
Oh, Okay, because I
Yeah.
thought there was some article I read when I looked you up, and it was something about consulting for the, or was it the NSA? It could have been, I can't remember. It was some agency. I mean, I could be wrong. Like I could be getting
Well,
completely mixed up.
you may have read that about my father. Uh,
Right.
my father worked as a civilian contractor for the Navy on a couple of top secret projects. One of them was for the CIA, actually. Do you remember the film Day of the Dolphin with George C. Scott in it?
No, I'm afraid not. I'm familiar with
Okay.
George C. Scott, but not Day of the
Yeah.
Dolphin. What's no?
Well,
What's
the
that?
film it was made in the either the late 60s or early or mid 70s. I don't remember. I've only seen it once or twice, but the film was about a Navy program to train dolphins to plant mines under ships. And the conceit of the film was that the dolphins would blow themselves up. And oh my, it's terrible because they're such intelligent creatures. Well, okay, it was based on what my father worked on. This film was based on it. Now, there is no way on God's green earth that the military would kill these trained dolphins. So the film was completely full of crap as far as this goes. It was it was your typical I'm sorry Hollywood liberal nonsense about oh, killing the dolphins. No, 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 no. The way it was actually working was they had mines strapped to their back, and the mines were magnetic and would release, and then they would plant the mine on the ship and then swim away to a safe distance. And then the timer would go off and it would blow a hole in the ship and sink it. And this was during the Vietnam War, and the whole idea was to sink ships in the Tonkin Gulf that were some kind of this is as far as it goes, as far as my understanding of it. But the key part of the project was in trying to develop a common language between dolphins and people. In the film, the dolphins were taught to speak English. And of course, that's not really doable because the dolphins don't have the necessary mouth parts to form English words. So the idea was to form a common language, something that both we could pronounce and the dolphins could pronounce. And my father's part of it was that he had invented this cryptographic algorithm that they thought was just perfectly suitable to for some reason for linguistics. And there is a branch of linguistics that deals with compression and I think cryptography. Because some of the principles involved with compressing and encrypting and then getting the same data back out without distortion, that for some reason, and I don't really understand how it works, but that for some reason is also applicable in linguistics. So that was really that what that had to do with. But yeah, my father was a physicist by training, so that was his PhD, and he worked all kinds of interesting things.
Wow. Okay. No, that's a story in and of itself, isn't it?
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
It is.
it's amazing. But in terms of Kanashimi though, we'll talk about your father soon. But I mean, let's say in terms of Kanashimi, um, what let's say when the film was shown on the screen in Seattle,
Hmm.
what was your
Yeah,
reaction? Had you seen, a film of yours shown on a screen, like a big screen?
never.
Never? No. Okay. Wow. How'd
No,
you
that was
feel?
the first time. It was a wonderful experience because I didn't realize how good it would look up there. I had seen it only on monitors, on computer monitors before then, and also on my television at home because I had streamed it to my TV, and I was trying to get a good handle on how it would look. And from a technical perspective, when you're doing things like color grading, you need to have a proper calibrated monitor. So I bought a couple of they're called HP Dream Color monitors, and Dream Color monitors are able to be color corrected for the I think it's Rec 709 standard that was standard at the time, which is proper color space and proper brightness and contrast and all that sort of thing. So I used the calibrated monitor to grade it. And what fascinated me was that it looked exactly the same in the movie theater that it did on my monitor, or very close to exactly. I think there were a couple of colors that were just ever so slightly different, but that's when you learn, aha, that's why colorists work with properly calibrated monitors, because that standard is what film theater projectors, digital projectors now are. That's how they're calibrated. So from a technical perspective, I was awed by that. I also, because it's a standard stereo mix, it's not like a 5.1 mix, but I was also fascinated at the way the stereo mix sounded. And But yeah, just from an emotional perspective, of course, it was fantastic because it was sort of a dream. And seeing it on the big screen was just a blast. And I saw it a total of 3 times on the screen. Once when we were, when we were getting the aspect ratio set and all that sort of thing, and then twice more at the premiere. And it was, it felt like a culmination of sorts. So
The
yeah, that's
culmination of
probably
all
more than,
those years of
yes,
sort of exactly right. So it was finally like you were able to make like you know, film as
a
opposed to say
proper film.
exactly, yeah, yeah,
Yes,
as opposed to maybe say a corporate video or a talent agency video, that kind of thing. You were
right.
finally able to, very good, very good. Now that is interesting. And so like, I mean, did you find yourself kind of like watching people's reactions and sort of like almost testing what their reactions were, or were you just so
Oh
in
yes.
with what? Oh, right, okay. What was
Oh
that like?
yes.
Yeah.
I was fascinated to watch how people were reacting, if they laughed in the right places, if they looked concerned or sad in the right places. And for the most part, they did. Something that I wasn't expecting was the thing that people complimented the most was the score. And I wasn't expecting that. I write music too and have most of my life. I'm an amateur composer. I am pretty well versed in music theory, but it's all self-study. I didn't really go to school for it. So I thought I was probably decent enough to compose the score, and I thought it was okay. I think it's a perfectly defensible, competent film score, but I got a lot of compliments on it that I wasn't expecting. I just was I thought, why I don't know why that stood out, but fine. It's one of the ironies of film scoring that rather poor music or rather mundane music or music that isn't particularly special or competent can actually work exceedingly well in a film because it doesn't take a lot of skill in compositional technique to come up with sounds that enhance the image because you can see immediately if it's working. You can, especially now with synthesis and sampling technology, you can just hit a key on the keyboard and go, "Ooh, yeah, that increases the tension." So yeah, you don't have to really be a very good composer to write a good film score, to write a serviceable film score, and that's something else to keep in mind. If you have no budget, if you can't pay someone or you can't find someone to do it for free, yeah, try goofing around on the keyboard. You'd be amazed. You might just hit something that works remarkably well.
You could use a pseudonym to make people think that you got someone else on board to
That's
do
right.
it.
That's right.
Wow, that's well, it was a tremendous score. I do remember that as well. It
Thank
was
you. I
very
appreciate it.
nice music. Just sort of hearing it was it really was atmospheric. And so I suppose for people who want to submit a film to a film festival at some point in their lives, what advice would you give to them? What advice would you give?
Well, you have to be pretty persistent and you have to submit to a lot of festivals. A lot of festivals. First thing we did, just from a sort of mechanical or a procedural perspective, is put it up on YouTube, put it up on oh goodness, that other one that's actually better, higher quality.
Vimeo?
Oh, Vimeo, thank you.
Yeah.
Put it up on Vimeo. Make sure it's a private link or an unpublished link because you don't want people watching it willy-nilly, even though you hope they will. Um, and that becomes a link that you can send out to the film festivals. Make sure that if you're using any copyrighted material, that you have releases for it. That's extremely important. Or that you can certify under penalty of death that that you own the copyright to everything, because that is something the festivals are concerned about. Make sure also that you're available for Q&A, that you respond quickly if they say, hey, we'd like to screen this, but we need to know some additional data. And make sure you're fairly persistent. Just keep writing them saying, hey, I submitted this a couple of weeks ago. Where are we in the process? Accepted, rejected, just let me know. So I think it was submitted to. I also got other folks involved, like the main actor, Thurman Kellogg, who I think did an extraordinary job. I just watched it again today, and I was thinking, goodness gracious, he was really good in this.
Yeah.
He was, and yeah, he also championed the film festivals, and he also helped to pay for some of the entry fees, which not having a huge amount of money, you have to sort of pick and choose the ones you can afford to enter. But yeah, it ended up being in, I think, about a dozen film festivals around the world. The most interesting one was it was in Belarus,
Oh.
and yeah, as part of the process, they got someone to translate the dialogue into Russian, and it actually has Russian subtitles. If you look in the on the festival version, and you click on the closed captioning or subtitles, you'll discover it actually has Russian as
Ah.
one of the languages. You can watch it. You can watch it with Russian. It's amazing.
Wow.
Uh,
That's huh.
yeah,
True internationalism. True
truly,
internationalism.
truly. I don't know why Belarus found it so interesting, but they did.
Well, it was a very, very good film indeed. It's so good to get that advice
Thank
for
you.
people hoping to submit to film festival because it's a difficult process, as you
It
know.
is.
It's a whole blend of like the artistic and the logistical and the practical and the corporate, even for want of a
Sure.
better word. I don't know much about that, unfortunately. So it's kind of like, I'm probably using crazy terms, but yeah, no, it's brilliant advice. It really is.
You also have to have promotional materials. You have
Oh,
to do that. You have to
yeah.
cut a trailer. There's really no argument there. You have to have poster art. You have to have website art, and these days you have to have a website too, that you can refer people to. And hopefully the website has the trailer embedded in it. And we did have all that. Fortunately, I also am an amateur visual artist. So I also created the poster art for it. And if you go to IMDb and look it up, you'll see it. It's up there. It's one of the stills that I put up. There's two or three different variants of the poster, but yeah, I tried to go for a sort of a Saul Bass approach with the poster. I don't know if you're familiar with Saul Bass, or
I am, but not as much as I should be.
he created some of the iconic poster art for both Kubrick and Hitchcock.
Ah, yes. Now I
And
remember. Yeah.
yeah, and he's the one that created that famous poster for The Shining,
Yeah.
that uh, sort of abstract,
With the face and the letters.
yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
abstraction and kind of a modern art approach. Those were his hallmarks. And he always tried to find the one best image that summarized what the film was like. And that one best image was turned into a sort of an abstracted form for the poster. One of his most famous was for Vertigo,
Oh, and
and
the
it's
spiral
yeah,
and yeah,
it's the
yeah, yeah.
spiral and then the silhouette of um, oh god, his character's name is Scotty Ferguson, falling into the spiral. Yeah, that was his
Very
thing.
good. Very good. Yeah. No, and now of course, how could I forget that? I was reading about him ages ago in that book, the I don't know if you have you read it, the Stanley Kubrick archive book.
Oh yes,
It's brilliant.
oh yes, it
Brilliant.
is, isn't
I
it?
think there's a Hitchcock one. I've never read that. Have you read that one?
There's been several Hitchcock ones. I have several of them. Probably not one that specializes in like the poster art, but there was the French are interesting because the French write these wonderful books about filmmakers.
Yeah.
Michel Ciment wrote a book about Kubrick that is, I think, definitive. And it's just called Kubrick.
Yeah.
It's like a coffee table book. It's beautiful. And he did one about Hitchcock as well that I have. And so anyway, it just wonderful, wonderful stuff. I don't know where I was going with that, but but yeah, the Kubrick Archive, fantastic book.
Fantastic. Well, I must say it's great to see, for other filmmakers as well, the influences that have influenced your work and how you've pulled original things from that and making your film Kanashimi. And obviously, again, I know I mentioned this, but I just think it's so important. It's so good to hear that advice for entering film festivals because it's such a, kind of long and difficult process. That's brilliant. So thank you very much indeed. And what's next for you? I mean, do you want to make a film again? Do you want to, you
I'd
know,
love to. I'd love to. I would. I think my fantasy still about this is that someone would see Kanashimi and say, "Ooh, I think he's at least competent enough to make a low budget genre picture or something." I probably never happened, but it would be kind of nice. And I wrote a story that I would love to do that would be fairly timely. It's about AI. It's sort of a science fiction piece about a professor who teaches advanced computer science and artificial intelligence, and it's set in the near future. He creates this robot that's a duplicate of himself, and then he dies. He's killed by his wife because there's bad problems between them. And the way the story would work out is that nobody really knows he's dead because the robot kind of takes his identity. The problem is the wife knows, and it becomes a cat and mouse game between her and the robot. And the big question that I want to pose, and the reason for the story, the reason it would even exist, is that we can't tell if this thing really has an interior life or if it's just regurgitating algorithmic versions of what this guy programmed it with. And her big fear is that this robot knows and is going to out her as having killed the real guy.
yeah.
And he seems like he's headed in that direction, but she can't tell, and we can't tell as the audience if there's any intent there or if it's just you know so the main point would be to ponder this notion of how mechanical intelligence is or self-awareness, and whether or not machines are capable of being self-aware the way we are, or if it's just a simulation. And if the simulation, and the real question is, if you can perfectly simulate a human being to the point where uh, that intelligence is indistinguishable from a real human, does it matter if there's an interior life or not? Does it, if you can't tell the difference, is there a difference? Right? It
Right.
goes back to this. It goes back to this thing. This concept of the philosophical zombie. A
Yeah.
philosophical zombie is a person who acts as though, for want of a better term, they have a soul, an interior life, but they don't. There's no self-awareness of any kind. They're just like an automaton that does a perfect impression of a person. And one of the conundrums in philosophy, the philosophy of consciousness, is that we are locked into our own skulls. We can never know if anybody else is truly conscious or if we're alone, if we're the only conscious entity that there is. Maybe I'm the only conscious person and you're an automaton, a perfect imitation of a person. And yeah, the idea seems silly on the face of it, but it's actually rather profound because
Oh
it
yeah.
gets to the heart of this matter. And the outer story might change. I might do something completely different with the outer story, but the inner story, which is this conundrum, that's the thing I really want to tell. That's the thing that fascinates me. And yet, but it has to be done in such a way that it's not so intellectual that it loses people.
Yeah.
Going back to Kubrick, it's got to tell a surface story that's engaging and that people will engage with and want to see, and which doesn't have all these trappings of depth or philosophical whatever, but that layer is there. And it's there if you look just a little bit deeper, and hopefully it'll send people home uh, questioning questioning their own identity. That's the
Well,
idea.
I don't.
I'd love to
Yeah,
make that.
no. I mean, you can do it. Definitely, you can do it. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see a theater full of people questioning their identity after a movie. It'll be interesting as a social experiment to see what happens to
And
them.
it's very timely. It's very timely.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it is. Tell me about it. It's like crazy the amount of AI talk and news you hear every day now at this point. It's exciting though in a weird
Mhm.
way. It's interesting. Well, sir, thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful for your time and best of luck with your future endeavors. And
Thank you.
have a great day.
It's
Thank you.
it's good to know someone's watching something I made. So
Well, I'm very
anyway,
much looking forward to your future works. I really am. So thank you.
well, thanks. I enjoyed it.